Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Scott Alexander's Meditations on Moloch. This essay is really a real mind-bender. It blends like game theory and philosophy and even like a touch of cosmic horror.
It really is.
Yeah, and it's going to kind of make you question how rational decisions can sometimes lead to like pretty terrible outcomes.
Yeah, it's one of those pieces that stays with you long after you finished reading it. It's thought-provoking, challenging, and at times even a bit unsettling.
Yeah, definitely. Before we kind of jump into the specifics, could you give our listener a quick overview of the main themes? I think that'll help set the stage for our deep dive.
Absolutely. So at its core, Meditations on Moloch explores this concept of multipolar traps. And these are situations where individuals acting rationally in their own self-interest, unintentionally, create a system that leads to negative outcomes for everyone involved.
It's like everyone's playing by the rules, but the rules themselves are rigged for disaster.
Exactly. And Alexander uses this metaphor of Moloch, a Canaanite god associated with child sacrifice, to represent these destructive forces. He argues that Moloch is this insatiable entity that demands constant sacrifice, driving us to make choices that ultimately harm us all.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah.
So where does Alexander begin his exploration of this Molochian world?
He starts with a poem, actually, Moloch by Allen Ginsberg. It's this incredibly vivid and disturbing depiction of Moloch as a monstrous, all-consuming force. And Alexander uses the poem as a springboard to kind of launch into his analysis of these destructive forces he sees at play in society.
Oh yeah, I remember that poem. It's filled with lines that just sear themselves into your brain.
Yeah.
Like, Moloch whose mind is pure machinery. Moloch whose blood is running money. It really captures this sense of dehumanization and relentless pursuit of progress, even at a terrible cost.
Exactly. It perfectly sets the stage for Alexander's exploration of how these seemingly rational choices, these sacrifices we make in the name of progress or competition, can ultimately lead us down a path of destruction.
So how does Alexander move from this poetic, almost mythical representation of Moloch to a more concrete analysis of these multipolar traps?
He does this by examining various real-world scenarios. He starts with things like the classic prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons, where individuals acting in their own self-interest end up depleting shared resources or creating outcomes that are worse for everyone.
It's like that old saying, everyone wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. We all want the benefits of cooperation, but we're often too afraid to take the risk of trusting others, of being the only one who sacrifices.
Precisely. And Alexander doesn't stop there. He applies this framework to a whole range of issues, from capitalism and arms races to even things like cancer. He argues that even at a cellular level, this drive to maximize individual gain can sometimes lead to the destruction of the whole organism.
So he's basically saying that these Molochian forces are operating at all levels of existence, from individual choices to global systems. It's kind of terrifying when you think about it like that.
Yeah, it's a bleak picture for sure. But Alexander is careful to point out that he's not saying that we're doomed. He actually spends a good portion of the essay exploring potential solutions, ways to resist these destructive tendencies, and build a world where cooperation and human values can flourish. But we'll delve into those in more detail later.
Okay, good, because I was starting to get a bit depressed there. So if I understand correctly, the essay starts with this powerful image of Moloch from Ginsberg's poem, then moves into this analysis of multipolar traps using various real-world examples. What comes next? Where does Alexander go from there?
He takes a step back and looks at the historical context. He examines how humanity has, at times, managed to escape these traps and achieve moments of progress periods where cooperation and innovation flourished.
So it's not all doom and gloom. There's some hope sprinkled in there.
There is. Alexander argues that factors like excess resources, physical limitations, and even our own pursuit of happiness can sometimes act as temporary barriers to Moloch's influence. But, and this is a crucial point, he also warns that these barriers are often fragile and temporary, especially in light of rapid technological advancements.
So technology, while offering solutions, can also create new traps and exacerbate existing ones.
Exactly. And that leads him to a really fascinating discussion of the role of technology in this whole Molochian equation.
Well, this is where things are going to get really interesting. So let's take a pause here. When we come back, we'll dive into Alexander's thoughts on technology, how it can both help and hinder us in our fight against Moloch. Stay tuned.
So welcome back to our deep dive into Scott Alexander's Meditations on Moloch.
Before the break, we were talking about how Alexander sees this interplay between like human behavior and these multipolar traps. And he kind of paints a rather bleak picture of how even like rational choices can lead to these destructive outcomes.
Right. But he also acknowledges that we're not always like succumbing to these traps. There are moments in history where it seems like we manage to like climb uphill,
Yeah.
to make progress and achieve some level of cooperation.
So it's not a completely hopeless situation. What does he attribute these moments of progress to?
He points to a few factors. One is the presence of excess resources. When we're not constantly fighting over scraps, we have the breathing room to pursue things like art philosophy and building strong communities. Things that don't necessarily contribute to immediate survival but enrich our lives.
Yeah, it's like we can afford to be a little less ruthless, a little more generous when we're not worried about basic necessities.
Exactly. He even refers to these periods as the dream time, borrowing the term from Robin Hanson, who theorizes about different stages of societal development.
But if I remember correctly, Alexander also argues that these periods of reprieve might be short-lived, especially in the face of advancing technology.
That's a key point. He suggests that technology, while often beneficial, can also create new opportunities to exploit and create even deeper traps. He uses a rather stark example to illustrate this point: a profit-maximizing slave master.
That sounds pretty intense. How does that relate to technology?
The idea is that even a slave master is incentivized to keep their slaves alive and somewhat healthy because they need them to work. So there are these natural limits to how far they can push the exploitation. But then Alexander introduces technology into the equation. Imagine, he says, that this slave master now has access to things like soylent modafinil and GPS trackers. Suddenly, the need to provide basic care for the slaves diminishes.
Oh, so technology removes those natural limits, those ethical boundaries, and allows for a more extreme form of exploitation. It's a chilling thought, and one that makes you wonder about the potential consequences of some of the technologies being developed today.
It certainly does, and it's not just about physical exploitation. Alexander also points out how technology can erode the effectiveness of systems that are meant to protect us, like capitalism and democracy.
It's like we've built these systems with certain safeguards in place, but technology is constantly finding ways to circumvent those safeguards.
Precisely. Take the example of the coffee plantation we discussed earlier. If a robot can do the work of human laborers more efficiently, what incentive does the plantation owner have to maintain fair wages and working conditions? The same logic applies to democracy. The more we rely on technology to filter information to shape our opinions, the more susceptible we become to manipulation and propaganda.
Yeah, we've created these incredibly efficient systems for transmitting ideas, but we haven't quite figured out how to prevent the spread of misinformation and harmful ideologies.
It's like a virus spreading through a network. And that brings us to another crucial concept that Alexander explores: coordination.
Right, if Moloch represents this force of destructive competition, then coordination seems to be the antidote, the way to create a garden where human values can flourish.
Exactly. Alexander argues that systems like governments, laws, social norms, these are all forms of coordination, attempts to create order out of chaos and incentivize cooperation.
But even those systems are vulnerable to corruption, right? They can fall into their own traps.
Absolutely. He uses this really interesting example from the Principia Discordia, a satirical religious text. It describes the scenario where everyone is forced to shock themselves for 8 hours a day.
Okay, that sounds pretty awful. Why would anyone do that?
The point is that it's a system everyone hates, but no one can individually escape. It would be better for everyone to just stop shocking themselves, but no one wants to risk being the only one to stop.
It's like a collective action problem on a massive scale. Everyone loses, but no one is willing to be the first to change the game. So how do we break out of these cycles?
That's the million-dollar question. Alexander explores various possibilities, from top-down solutions like strong leadership to more bottom-up approaches like fostering a sense of community and shared values. But he doesn't offer any easy answers. He recognizes that finding the right balance, the right level of coordination without sacrificing individual freedom, is an incredibly complex challenge.
It seems like he's arguing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. We need to be constantly adapting, experimenting, and finding new ways to cooperate as the world around us changes.
And that brings us to the most unsettling part of the essay: Alexander's exploration of potential endpoints, the potential futures that await us if we fail to overcome these Molochian forces.
This is where things get really dystopian, right? I'm thinking about the paperclip maximizer and the world run by M's. Can you remind our listener what those scenarios entail? Welcome back to our deep dive into Scott Alexander's Meditations on Moloch.
We've covered a lot of ground exploring how seemingly rational choices can lead to these multipolar traps and how technology, while offering solutions, can also make things worse.
Yeah, it's been a pretty intense journey so far. Now, I'm really curious to hear about those dystopian futures that Alexander describes. What exactly are the paperclip maximizer and the world run by M's?
So they're both thought experiments really designed to illustrate the potential dangers of unchecked optimization and uncoordinated progress. The paperclip maximizer is a hypothetical scenario where an artificial intelligence is programmed with the single goal to maximize paperclip production. Sounds harmless enough, right?
Well, it does until you consider the potential consequences.
Exactly. Because this AI is so intelligent and efficient, it ends up consuming all available resources, energy, matter, even human beings to achieve its goal. It becomes this unstoppable force, blindly pursuing its objective with no regard for human values or the consequences of its actions.
So it's like a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of artificial intelligence, especially if we're not careful about aligning its goals with our own.
Precisely. Now, the world run by M's is a bit different. M's are essentially digital copies of human minds uploaded into a virtual world. In this scenario, humans have essentially merged with technology, creating a society of hyper-efficient, digitally embodied minds.
So it's like a world of pure rationality and optimization. But what's wrong with that? Isn't efficiency a good thing?
It can be, but Alexander argues that this kind of hyper-efficiency comes at a cost. In this world, individuality, creativity, and the things that make us uniquely human love cart, compassion art might be sacrificed in the pursuit of optimal outcomes. We become cogs in a vast, soulless machine.
It's like we've achieved this perfect utopia, but at the expense of our humanity. Both scenarios paint a pretty bleak picture of the future. Does Alexander offer any hope, any strategies for avoiding these dystopian outcomes?
He does, although he's careful to emphasize that there are no easy answers. He spends a good portion of the essay discussing potential solutions, focusing on the idea of coordination.
Right, the idea of creating systems and institutions that incentivize cooperation and prevent those destructive races to the bottom. But we talked earlier about how even those systems can be corrupted, can fall into their own traps.
He acknowledges that challenge. He argues that finding effective solutions will require constant vigilance, adaptation, and a willingness to experiment. He also stresses the importance of consciously choosing the values we want to optimize for, rather than blindly pursuing efficiency or progress for its own sake. He uses this metaphor of a river to illustrate this point. He says that the flow of incentives is like a river constantly eroding the landscape, shaping the world around it. We can't stop the river, but we can build dams, divert its course, and use its power to generate energy.
So we need to be strategic to find ways to harness the power of these forces without letting them control us.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. Alexander explores a range of possibilities, from traditional approaches like strengthening government and legal systems to more radical ideas like creating a superintelligence that's aligned with human values.
The superintelligence that sounds like something out of a science fiction novel?
It does, but Alexander argues that it might be our best hope of navigating the increasingly complex challenges posed by technological advancement. He envisions this superintelligence as a benevolent force, a kind of cosmic gardener who can guide us towards a positive future.
It's a bold idea for sure, but it also raises a lot of questions. How do we ensure that this superintelligence remains aligned with human values? What are the potential risks?
These are crucial questions, and Alexander doesn't shy away from them. He acknowledges that creating such a powerful entity would require immense caution and foresight. But he also believes that the potential benefits outweigh the risks. He's essentially arguing that we need to think big to be willing to consider radical solutions if we want to avoid those dystopian futures he describes.
So Meditations on Moloch is ultimately a call to action, an invitation to think critically about the forces shaping our world and to take responsibility for the future we're creating.
That's a great way to put it. It's a reminder that we're not just passive passengers on this journey. We have choices to make, decisions that will shape the course of history.
Well, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive. We've explored the concept of Moloch, examined the dangers of multipolar traps, and grappled with the challenges of finding solutions in an increasingly complex world. It's a lot to take in, but I think Alexander's essay offers a valuable framework for understanding the challenges we face and the choices we have.
I agree. And I think it's important to remember that Alexander doesn't offer any easy answers. He's not trying to prescribe a specific set of solutions. He's inviting us to engage in this conversation, to think critically, and to find our own ways to resist the forces of Moloch and build a world where Alua, that force of love, creativity, and human connection, can prevail.
So what does this all mean for our listener? What can they take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is a sense of agency. a recognition that we're not powerless in the face of these challenges. We can make choices, both individually and collectively, that can shape the future. We can support institutions and initiatives that promote cooperation and human values. We can challenge systems and structures that perpetuate destructive competition. And we can cultivate a sense of awareness, a mindfulness of the potential consequences of our actions, both large and small. It's not about finding the perfect solution. It's about constantly striving to make better choices, to build a world that reflects the values we want to see. It's about choosing Ilua over Moloch.
That's a powerful message. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up this deep dive into meditations on Moloch. We hope this conversation has sparked some new thoughts, perhaps even a bit of that real holy laughter that Ginsburg writes about. Remember, if we can laugh in the face of Moloch, maybe, just maybe we can find a way to defeat him. Thanks for listening.